Michael Reeves had spent most of his life working in high-risk environments, first as a firefighter and later as a fire safety inspector. He had seen enough destruction, loss, and senseless tragedies to last a lifetime, and when an injury forced him into early retirement, he took it as a sign to finally step away from the chaos. He had no interest in city life anymore, the endless noise, the congestion, the people who never seemed to respect personal space. What he wanted more than anything was solitude. A place where he could wake up to silence, breathe fresh air, and not feel the weight of the world pressing down on him every time he stepped outside. That was why he had purchased the property, 10 acres of land at the end of a long, winding gravel road, surrounded by dense forest, with no direct neighbors in sight. It was perfect. The property had been a lucky find, one of those rare pieces of land that hadn't been gobbled up by developers looking to cram as many houses as possible into a single plot. The previous owner, an older man in declining health, had been eager to sell quickly, and Michael had taken full advantage of that urgency. The house itself was nothing spectacular and older, single-story structure with a detached garage and a large workshop that had been used for woodworking. But the land, the sheer isolation of it, made up for any cosmetic flaws. There was a private driveway leading from the main road, cutting through the trees like a forgotten path in an old forest. It was unpaved, uneven in some places, but it was his. That road was the only way in and out of the property, and once he turned off the main road, there was no reason for anyone to be there unless they were coming to see him. That was exactly how he wanted it. For the first few weeks, everything was exactly as he had imagined. He spent his mornings drinking coffee on the porch, watching the sun rise through the trees. He worked on minor repairs around the house, fixed up the garage, and made plans to renovate the workshop into something useful. The quiet was a luxury he hadn't realized he needed so badly. No sirens, no honking horns, no neighbors knocking on his door for some trivial nonsense. Just silence, interrupted only by the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant cry of an animal deeper in the woods. Then he started noticing the tire tracks. At first he thought they were his own. He had been driving up and down the road a lot lately, hauling supplies, getting a feel for the land. But after a few days he realized the patterns didn't match. Some of the tracks were fresh, despite the fact that he hadn't driven anywhere in over 24 hours. Someone had been using his driveway. The first time he saw the vehicle, he assumed it was just a lost driver turning around. A dark-colored SUV had rolled down the gravel path, slowed near his house, then casually made a wide U-turn before heading back the way it came. Michael had stepped onto the porch, expecting the driver to acknowledge him, maybe offer a wave or some form of apology for trespassing. But they never even looked in his direction. It happened again the next day. A different car, this time a pickup truck, moving at a leisurely pace, as if the driver had every right to be there. It didn't slow down near the house like the first one had. Instead, it drove straight through, using his driveway as a shortcut. That was when he knew this wasn't just lost drivers. This was deliberate. Michael didn't react immediately. He didn't storm out to confront them, didn't start making threats or calling the police. He had dealt with enough high-stress situations in his life to know that knee-jerk reactions rarely led to good outcomes. Instead, he observed. He watched. Over the next several days, he kept track of when the vehicles appeared, what models they were, and whether they followed any kind of pattern. He noticed that they always came from the same direction and exited the same way, as if this was a known route rather than just a convenient turnaround spot. Then came Colin Langley. Michael hadn't met any of his neighbors yet. There weren't many to begin with, and he hadn't felt any pressing need to introduce himself. But Colin made that unnecessary. He showed up one afternoon, not by walking up the driveway like a normal person, but by driving straight down the gravel path, stopping his truck directly in front of the house and stepping out like he owned the place. Michael had been in the middle of replacing some of the porch railing when he noticed the truck approaching. He didn't move immediately, just watched as the man, a heavy-set guy in his late 40s, with the kind of face that always looked like it was slightly annoyed, slammed his door shut and took a slow look around before settling his gaze on Michael. "You, the new guy?" Colin asked, as if this was a job site and not Michael's private property. Michael wiped his hands on a rag, sizing the man up before answering. Yeah. Colin nodded, looking around again, eyes scanning the house, the garage, the workshop. Nice spot. Michael didn't bother responding to that. He already knew it was a nice spot. That was why he bought it. Instead, he got straight to the point. You lost. Colin laughed, a short, condescending chuckle that made it clear he didn't take the question seriously. Nah, man. I've been using this road for years. Cuts right through to the main road. Way faster than taking the long way around. Michael didn't smile. It's private property. Yeah, I get it, Colin said, waving a hand dismissively. But look, it's been like this forever. The old guy who lived here, he didn't care. Never said a word about it. I figured you'd be the same. Michael let that sink in for a moment before shaking his head. I'm not. Colin studied him, as if trying to determine whether he was serious or just posturing. Then he smiled, the kind of smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. Well, we'll see how that goes. And with that, he got back into his truck, reversed out, and disappeared down the driveway. Michael stood there for a long moment, watching the dust settle, knowing with absolute certainty that this was going to be a problem. Michael didn't waste time after Colin's visit. He had dealt with men like him before, the type who assumed that because something had always been a certain way, it meant they had some unspoken right to it. He knew this wouldn't be a one-time conversation. Colin wasn't going to just accept the new rules and move on. That wasn't how people like him operated. They didn't ask for permission, they acted first and dared anyone to challenge them later. And when they were challenged, they didn't back down easily. They pushed, tested limits, and waited to see how far they could go before someone pushed back harder. The next morning, Michael walked the length of his driveway, checking for any signs that someone had used it overnight. The gravel was still soft from recent rain, and sure enough, there were fresh tire tracks leading toward the main road. Not just one set, but multiple. Different patterns, different depths. This wasn't just Colin passing through, others were using this road too. He spent the afternoon driving into town, buying supplies, thick wooden posts, chains, and heavy-duty locks. When he got home, he wasted no time installing them. The posts went deep into the ground on either side of the driveway entrance, reinforced with concrete. The chain stretched between them, thick enough that no one was going to cut through it easily. He mounted a sign to one of the posts, "Private property, no trespassing." He didn't expect it to be respected. That wasn't the point. The point was to force a reaction. If Colin was serious about what he had said, he'd push back. If he wasn't, he'd find another route and move on. Either way, Michael would get his answer. That night, he sat on his porch, a beer in hand, watching the driveway. He wasn't paranoid, but he also wasn't naive. The kind of people who ignored boundaries didn't just accept them overnight. Sure enough, just after midnight, he heard the sound of tires crunching against gravel. He leaned forward slightly, keeping his movements slow, deliberate. Headlights appeared through the trees, moving steadily toward the barrier. The vehicle slowed, idled for a moment, then the engine cut off. Michael didn't move. He didn't need to. Whoever was out there wasn't lost. They knew exactly where they were. A few moments later, a sharp metallic noise cut through the quiet night. The unmistakable sound of bolt cutters snapping through chain links. Michael exhaled slowly through his nose. So that was how this was going to go. The chain rattled as it hit the ground. Then the engine revved back to life, headlights sweeping across the trees as the vehicle moved forward. The driver didn't even hesitate, just drove straight over the fallen barrier, as if it had never been there in the first place. Michael could have gone out there, could have confronted whoever it was. But he didn't. Not yet. He needed to see how far this would go. Instead, he memorized every detail. The vehicle was a truck, older, probably a Ford or Chevy based on the shape of the headlights. He listened to the way the tires moved, noting the sound of worn-out suspension. He stayed in the shadows, watching as the truck passed by his house without slowing, heading toward the main road as if nothing had happened. The next morning he found the chain discarded on the side of the road, cleanly cut in two places. The sign had been knocked over, one of the wooden posts slightly tilted where the truck's bumper had clipped it. Michael gathered the broken pieces and brought them back to his garage. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. He was just interested now. Because this wasn't just about Colin being entitled. There was something else happening here. The way the truck had moved, the way the driver hadn't hesitated, it felt practiced. Routine. Like they had done this before. Later that afternoon, Michael saw Colin again. This time he wasn't alone. He was standing near the entrance of the driveway talking to another man, thinner, wiry, wearing a jacket that looked too big for him. The moment they saw Michael step outside, the conversation stopped. Colin smirked, said something to his companion, then turned toward Michael. "Looks like your little fence didn't last long," Colin said, nodding toward the driveway. Michael crossed his arms. "Yeah, someone really wanted to get through." "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Colin spread his hands, feigning innocence. "Hey man, I told you I've been using that road for years. If you want to block it off, that's your business. But not everyone around here thinks that's such a good idea." Michael studied him carefully. Colin was enjoying this too much. He wasn't just some lazy neighbor who didn't want to change his habits. He was testing Michael, seeing how much of a fight he was willing to put up. "You think it's a bad idea?" Michael asked. Colin shrugged. "I think you're making things harder on yourself. This is a small town. People talk. You start stepping on toes, suddenly folks aren't so friendly. You might find things inconvenient." Michael let a slow smile form. "I like inconvenient." Colin's smirk faltered just a little before he turned away. "Suit yourself." Michael watched as he and the wiry man walked back to their truck. They didn't leave right away, though. They sat there for a few minutes, engine idling, as if waiting to see what Michael would do next. He didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. He just stood there, arms crossed, watching them right back. Eventually, the truck pulled away, disappearing down the road. That night, Michael didn't sleep much. He wasn't afraid. He had dealt with worse things in his life. But there was a difference between handling emergencies when they happened and knowing something was coming but not knowing exactly when. At around 3 in the morning, he heard it again. This time he was ready. He had set up a simple trick: an old, empty tin can, tied to a fishing line that stretched across the driveway entrance. It wasn't sophisticated, but it didn't need to be. It just needed to tell him when someone was there. And now it did. A soft metallic clatter, barely audible, but enough. Michael sat up in bed, slid his feet into his boots, and grabbed the flashlight from his nightstand. He moved slowly, keeping his steps light as he made his way to the front door. He didn't turn on any lights. No need to let them know he was awake. When he reached the window, he saw exactly what he expected. A truck, the same one from before, parked just beyond the broken chain. 2 figures stood near it, talking in hushed voices. One of them, the wiry man, held something in his hands. A crowbar. Michael felt something cold settle in his chest. This wasn't just about trespassing anymore. They weren't just driving through. They were planning to come in. Michael stood motionless by the window, his pulse steady but his mind already working through the possibilities. 2 men, one holding a crowbar. They weren't here to talk. They weren't even trying to be quiet. The truck idled low, headlights off, parked just past where his chain had been cut. They were testing him, seeing how much resistance he was willing to put up. Maybe they assumed he was asleep, or maybe they didn't care. Either way, this was something different. This was a threat. He moved carefully through the house, avoiding the floorboards that creaked. He wasn't about to charge out there like some fool looking for a confrontation. Men who brought crowbars in the middle of the night weren't the kind to back down just because someone yelled at them. He reached for the shotgun he kept near the door, not because he intended to use it, but because people like this understood force. If they wanted to act like there were no rules, he'd remind them whose land they were on. He stepped onto the porch, not bothering to turn on any lights. The night was clear, the moon bright enough to cast their figures in sharp relief against the gravel. The wiry man with the crowbar nudged Colin, saying something low and amused. Colin turned, hands in his pockets, and spotted Michael standing there, barely a shadow against the house. They both froze. Michael didn't raise the gun, didn't move aggressively. He just let the silence stretch, let them realize they were the ones exposed. "You're on my property," he said evenly. Colin smirked, but there was a flicker of hesitation. "Relax, man. We were just passing through." Michael glanced at the crowbar. And that. The wiry man lowered it slightly, not dropping it but no longer holding it so openly. "Figured we'd clear some of this junk you left on the road. Didn't want anyone getting hurt." Michael's jaw tightened. He took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them just enough to make them uncomfortable. "You cut my chain, you're trespassing. And now you're standing in my driveway in the middle of the night with a weapon in your hand. So let's not pretend this is about safety." Colin's smirk hardened into something colder. "You keep making things difficult. We wouldn't be here if you just let things stay the way they've always been." Michael exhaled slowly through his nose. There it was. The confirmation. This wasn't just about a shortcut. It wasn't just about some neighbor too lazy to take the long way around. There was something else at play here. He didn't answer. Instead, he shifted his grip on the shotgun just enough to make a point, resting it against his shoulder. "Get off my land." For a moment, no one moved. Then Colin exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Come on," he muttered to the other man. "Not worth it." The wiry man hesitated, glancing between them, as if considering whether to push the issue. Then he nodded once, tossing the crowbar into the truck bed. They climbed into the cab, slammed the doors shut, and backed up slowly, their tires kicking up dust. Michael watched them go, waiting until the taillights disappeared down the road. Only then did he lower the shotgun. This wasn't over. The next morning he drove into town. Not to the police, he already knew how that would go. No clear crime had been committed, no injuries, nothing concrete beyond a cut chain and some late-night intimidation. No, he went to the hardware store instead, buying heavy-duty steel bollards. The kind you sank deep into the ground and filled with concrete. The kind that didn't just block a road but made it impossible to pass without serious effort. He spent the entire afternoon installing them, setting them deep, making sure there was no easy way to remove them. By the time he was finished, he was covered in sweat, his hands raw from digging, but he felt something close to satisfaction. Let them try to cut through that. That night he stayed up, waiting. The truck didn't come back. Neither did Colin. For the first time in weeks, no one drove through. No fresh tire tracks in the morning. No signs of trespassing. Maybe, just maybe, they had decided it wasn't worth the trouble. But Michael knew better than to believe in easy victories. 3 days passed in silence. Then, on the 4th, something changed. It was early morning when he stepped outside and saw a dead animal, right at the edge of his driveway. A rabbit, its body twisted unnaturally, throat cut clean. Not the work of another animal. This was deliberate. A message. Michael didn't react. Didn't let himself get angry, didn't let himself show anything. He simply grabbed a shovel, scooped up the body, and disposed of it without a word. That afternoon he heard voices near the road. Not directly in his driveway, but close enough. Low, muttering conversation. He stepped outside, moving toward the tree line, careful not to make a sound. Colin was there, talking to someone Michael didn't recognize. A tall man, broad shoulders, dark jacket. He wasn't laughing, wasn't smirking. This one looked serious. Michael didn't need to hear the words to know what was happening. Colin had brought in someone else. Someone who didn't see this as a neighborly dispute. Someone who wasn't here just to make a point. Michael let out a slow breath, his mind shifting into the mode he knew best, preparing for the next step. This wasn't just about a road anymore. This was a fight. Michael had seen men like this before. The broad-shouldered man talking to Colin wasn't here for pleasantries or neighborhood disputes. He carried himself differently, with the kind of confidence that came from knowing people didn't say no to him often. Even from a distance, Michael could see the way his posture shifted, how his head tilted slightly whenever Colin spoke, as if weighing every word, deciding whether or not this was worth his time. This wasn't a friend, a relative, or another entitled neighbor looking to cut through someone else's property for convenience. This was a problem solver, and that meant Colin had escalated the situation in a way Michael hadn't anticipated. He stayed hidden in the tree line, watching. He didn't need to get closer to know what was happening. Colin was explaining the situation, trying to justify why he had called in outside help. The man listened, expression unreadable, nodding occasionally but saying little. Then, without a word, he turned, scanned the tree line, and looked directly at Michael's position. Michael's stomach tightened, but he didn't move. He kept his breathing slow, his posture relaxed. It was a gamble. Either the man had seen him, or he was just making a point, testing whether or not he was actually being watched. A few long seconds passed. Then he turned back to Colin and said something brief before heading toward his vehicle. Colin stood there for a moment, then followed. They left together, the sound of their tires crunching against gravel fading into the distance. Michael waited until they were gone before stepping out of his cover. His pulse was steady, but the weight of the situation had changed. This wasn't some local idiot throwing a tantrum anymore. Colin had brought someone in, someone who noticed things, who knew how to scan an area and pick up on subtle details. That wasn't normal. That wasn't how disputes over a damn driveway usually went. And that meant Michael needed to start thinking differently. He spent the rest of the day reinforcing his property. He didn't just add more barriers, he changed his approach. The bollards he had installed were solid, but they only blocked vehicles. If someone was determined enough, they could just walk right past them. He needed something that would deter anyone from stepping foot on his land. He started by laying down a bed of broken glass and old nails just beyond the entrance. It was crude, but effective. A person might step carefully, but a vehicle wouldn't. He dug shallow trenches along the sides of the driveway, filling them with debris and covering them with leaves. If someone tried to drive off the path, they'd feel it immediately. Then he focused on visibility. He cut down excess brush near the tree line, giving himself a clear line of sight from the house to the road. If someone tried to sneak up on him, they wouldn't have much cover. By the time he was done, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. He wiped sweat from his forehead, feeling a familiar sense of satisfaction, not just from the work itself, but from being prepared. He had spent years in situations where planning meant the difference between life and death. He wasn't about to start making mistakes now. That night, the truck came back. Michael had expected it. He sat on his porch in the dark, shotgun resting across his lap, waiting. The engine noise was different this time, slower, more deliberate. They weren't just passing through. They were looking, testing his patience. The headlights cut out just before the bollards. A door opened, then closed softly. Michael's grip tightened slightly on the shotgun. He didn't stand, didn't move. He just listened. Footsteps, careful, deliberate, crunching over gravel. Whoever it was, they were trying to be quiet, but the night was too still. He could hear everything. A few more steps, then silence. Michael exhaled slowly, waiting. They were standing there, just out of sight, watching him. He didn't speak. Didn't call out. He wanted them to make the first move. The seconds stretched long, the tension thick enough to cut. Then, just as quietly as they had arrived, the footsteps retreated. A car door opened. The truck started. And then they were gone. Michael sat there for a long time after they left. He wasn't angry. He wasn't scared. But he knew with absolute certainty that things had changed. They hadn't come to break anything. They hadn't come to confront him. They had come to see if he was afraid. And now, they had their answer. Michael had spent enough time around dangerous men to recognize a shift in tactics. What had started as arrogance, Colin acting like his property was some public thoroughfare, had now turned into something calculated. The visit the night before hadn't been about intimidation. It had been a test. Whoever that man was, the one Colin had brought in, he wasn't just some local thug. He was patient, careful, and methodical. And he wanted to see how Michael would react, whether he would come outside, make threats, call the police, or just stay put. But Michael hadn't given them anything. And now they would change their approach. The next morning, Michael walked his property as he always did, checking for signs that someone had returned in the night. The trenches he had dug along the sides of the driveway were undisturbed, the makeshift barriers still intact. But then, as he reached the far edge of the clearing near his garage, he saw it, a symbol, drawn in white paint on the side of his storage shed. Simple, almost lazy 3 lines crossing over each other, forming an angular mark he didn't recognize. It wasn't graffiti. It wasn't some random act of vandalism. It was a message. He stood there for a moment, studying it, feeling the weight of it settle into his chest. This wasn't some local kids messing around. This was intentional. They wanted him to know they had been here. They had walked onto his land, stood near his home, marked his property like a hunter marking territory. Michael didn't touch it. He didn't scrub it off. He just memorized it, burned the shape into his mind, then turned and walked back inside. This was no longer about a driveway. By midday, he was in town, not at the police station, but at the gun store. He didn't waste time with small talk. The owner, a man named Ray, had known Michael for years back when he was still working fire inspections and spending weekends at the range. "You looking for something in particular?" Ray asked, leaning on the counter. Michael nodded. "More slugs. And a second shotgun." Ray raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. Something happened. Michael met his gaze. "Something's going to." Ray studied him for a long moment, then nodded and disappeared into the back. He returned a minute later, setting down a tactical pump action beside a box of shells. "I'd keep it loaded but out of sight." "You expecting trouble?" "More like preparing for it." Ray didn't press further. He just rang him up, gave a slow nod, and said, "Watch your back." Michael left without another word. That night, he set up floodlights. The kind that didn't just light up the area but blinded anyone standing in them. He mounted them high on the trees near the driveway and wired them to motion sensors. If anyone stepped foot onto his property again, they wouldn't be sneaking in the dark. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Nothing. Then at 3:17 a.m., the floodlights exploded to life. Michael was awake instantly, gun in hand, before his feet even touched the floor. He moved quickly, checking the monitors for his security cameras. The screen flickered, grainy in the darkness, but there they were 3 figures standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond the driveway. They weren't moving. They weren't trying to break anything. They were just watching. Michael didn't hesitate. He grabbed his shotgun, threw open the front door, and stepped onto the porch, racking a shell into the chamber loud enough to cut through the night air. The figures didn't flinch. They just stood there. Then, after what felt like an eternity, they turned and disappeared into the woods. Michael stood there for a long time, the cold air biting at his skin, heart pounding slow and steady. They weren't here to vandalize. They weren't here to threaten. They were waiting for him to break first. Michael spent the next few hours sitting in the dark, shotgun still in his hands, running through the conversation in his head. He had expected threats, maybe even an ultimatum, but not that. "You're not the one we were waiting for." The words stuck with him, circling his thoughts like a riddle with no clear answer. It meant something, but he didn't have enough pieces to put it together yet. He wasn't a paranoid man, never had been, but everything about this was wrong. The fact that they left without pushing further wasn't reassuring, it was unsettling. They had tested him, threatened him, trespassed onto his land multiple times, but now, after weeks of escalation, they were just walking away. It didn't add up. By morning, Michael was already moving. He barely touched his coffee, mind too preoccupied, body running on muscle memory as he ran another check of the property. He had been over every inch of it 100 times since this started, but he needed to see it again, needed to make sure there wasn't something he had missed. He checked the tree line where the men had stood, scanning for anything they might have left behind. Nothing. He followed the faint traces of their footprints, noting the direction they had come from and where they had left. They hadn't parked near the driveway, meaning they had gone deeper into the woods before circling back to the road. Again, careful, precise. It made him grind his teeth. He had dealt with plenty of reckless men in his time, hotheads who didn't know when to back down, but these weren't amateurs. These were people who knew how to avoid leaving a trail. That was the part that gnawed at him the most. He spent the next few hours reinforcing everything again. More barriers, more tripwires, another layer of deterrence. He wasn't delusional. He knew that if someone really wanted to get onto his property, nothing short of a reinforced perimeter and armed guards was going to stop them. But this wasn't about keeping them out. This was about sending a message: you want to come back. It's going to cost you. Let them wonder what else he had waiting for them. Let them think twice. But the day passed, and night fell, and no one returned. Then another day. Then another. For the first time since this started, nothing happened. Michael didn't relax, but he noticed the shift. The tension hadn't disappeared, but it had changed. Like a storm that had passed but left behind an uneasy silence. The tracks at the edge of his property never reappeared. The truck never returned. Even Colin, who had spent weeks trying to push him, was nowhere to be seen. The bastard had been a permanent thorn in his side since the day they met, but now it was like he had vanished off the face of the earth. No casual smirks, no veiled threats, no circling like a vulture waiting for Michael to crack. Just silence. And that was worse than anything else. Michael wasn't naive. He knew when something felt off. The men that had come to his land weren't the type to just give up. If they weren't coming back, it wasn't because they had decided to respect his boundaries. It was because something had changed. He needed answers. Driving into town felt like stepping into a different world. After weeks of watching his back, reinforcing his land, preparing for the next fight, being around normal people going about their day felt unnatural. The grocery store, the gas station, the coffee shop, everything was just as he had left it, completely untouched by whatever had been unfolding on his property. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but Colin was the key. If something had changed, it had started with him. He found the answer at the hardware store. The cashier, a woman named Lisa, who had always been too chatty for her own good, gave him a knowing look the moment he walked in. "You hear about Colin?" Michael kept his expression neutral. "No, what about him?" She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "He packed up and left 2 nights ago. Just like that. Didn't tell anybody where he was going, just loaded up a truck and took off. Some folks say he got into trouble with the wrong people. Others think he finally decided to stop pissing off everyone around him." She gave him a pointed look at that last part, like she knew damn well what had been happening between them. Michael's stomach clenched. 2 nights ago. The same night those men had come back. The same night they had said, "You're not the one we were waiting for." He forced himself to stay calm, nodding like it was nothing more than an interesting piece of gossip. "That's so." Lisa smirked. "Guess you won, huh?" Michael just gave a short chuckle, paid for his things, and walked out. The moment he was back in his truck, his fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Colin was gone. Just like that. And it wasn't because he had lost. It was because he had run. Michael's mind raced through the implications. The men who had come to his land, they hadn't been there for him. They had been there for Colin. He had brought them in to handle a problem, thinking he was in control, but somewhere along the way, the tables had turned. They had realized he wasn't useful anymore. And Colin, for all his arrogance, had understood exactly what that meant. Michael let out a slow breath, tension coiling tight in his chest. This wasn't over. He didn't know what the men had wanted. He didn't know why they had marked his land, why they had watched him, why they had tested him. But he knew one thing for sure. Colin had been afraid of something, and whatever it was still out there. Trevon stared at the key resting inside the box, its polished surface gleaming under the dim light. He didn't want to touch it. Every part of him screamed that this was a trap, a carefully placed piece in whatever game Douglas had been playing. But walking away wasn't an option. Not anymore. His house had already been invaded, his sense of security ripped away. Ignoring it wouldn't change that. So he reached down, his fingers closing around the cold metal. The second he lifted it, something shifted. A sound so faint he almost didn't hear it, a click, like a lock sliding into place. He turned sharply, scanning the room, his breath steady despite the pulse hammering in his ears. Nothing had changed. But something felt different. He checked the windows. Still locked. The hallway empty. He turned the key over in his palm, studying it. No markings. Just an ordinary house key. Except it wasn't his. He stepped out of the bedroom, his grip tightening as he moved through the house, checking every door. Front, back, garage. He tested them all. None matched the key. His stomach twisted. If it didn't belong to his house, then... His eyes flicked toward the front window. Douglas' house. It hit him all at once. Douglas hadn't just broken in to intimidate him. He had given him something. An opening. A challenge. Trevon had spent days reacting, waiting for Douglas' next move. But this? This was different. A sharp gust of wind rattled the porch railing outside, and before he could second-guess himself, he was already moving. The world outside felt still, unnervingly quiet. The street was empty. The air thick with something he couldn't name. His feet carried him forward, past the fence, toward the house next door. Douglas' porch light was off, his curtains drawn. But Trevon knew he was watching. He always was. He stepped onto the wooden planks, the boards groaning beneath his weight, and reached for the door handle. It turned too easily, unlocked. His pulse quickened. He slid the key into the lock, half expecting it not to fit. It turned perfectly. The door creaked open. The house smelled like dust, stale air, something faintly metallic beneath it all. The living room was dimly lit by the glow of a single lamp, casting long shadows across the walls. Furniture sat neatly in place, nothing disturbed. No signs of struggle. No mess. Just stillness. Trevon took a slow step inside. The floorboards didn't creak. It was as if the house was holding its breath. He moved further in, his senses on high alert. The walls were lined with shelves, books stacked in careful rows. A clock ticked somewhere in the distance. The kitchen was spotless, every dish in place, the countertops gleaming. It looked lived in, but not recently. Like a perfectly staged replica of someone's home. Then he saw it. A door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. Something shifted in his chest. A deep, instinctual warning. Leave. But he had come too far to turn back now. He moved toward it, his breath steady, his grip tightening around the key. He pushed the door open. The basement stairs stretched downward, swallowed by darkness. A faint hum drifted up from below, like an old appliance running somewhere deep inside. He exhaled slowly, his heartbeat a steady drum in his ears. He took the first step. Then another. The wood felt solid beneath his feet, but the air grew heavier the further he went. The light at the bottom flickered. Then he saw them. Boxes. Dozens of them. Lined up neatly along the walls, labeled in thick black ink. Some names he recognized. Roger Cook. Linda Cook. Others were unfamiliar. Names of people he had never met. But they all had something in common. They were all previous owners of his house. His throat tightened. He stepped closer, reaching for the nearest box, his hands cold as he lifted the lid. Inside, carefully arranged, were personal belongings, photographs, old keys, faded documents, pieces of lives erased. A sharp creak from the stairs made him freeze. He turned slowly. Douglas stood at the top, watching. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Douglas smiled. A slow, knowing expression. "I told you," he said softly. "You shouldn't be here." Trevon's grip on the box tightened. His mind raced through possibilities, through every outcome of this moment. He wasn't sure what Douglas was capable of. Not entirely. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a fence. It had never been. And now, standing in the belly of the house, surrounded by the remnants of people who had come before him, Trevon knew one thing for certain. He wasn't leaving this place the way he had come in.